Welcome to our study of Jamgon Mipham's Sword of Wisdom. And what we're doing here is essentially establishing what is sound science and what is flawed science. And like Tongsa Rinpoche once said, the value of philosophy, you could say what we're doing here, looking at the nature of things beyond appearances, is not an end in itself. Its objective is to establish faith. The thing is, once we know where we're heading, once we have a sense of certainty about what we're doing, and we essentially are identifying what it is that we need to eliminate and what it is that we need to cultivate, and particularly also that we can trust the project that we're undertaking, that provides complete confidence. And that's where we then, you could say, the journey begins, because there's a certainty about the nature of what's taking place. So of course, sometimes we need a lot of explanation. Some people need a lot of convincing, others not so much. But the value of having initially doubt and then being convinced actually provides for a very strong degree of faith, and possibly even what we could call irreversible faith. Irreversible certainty brings, or you could say complete certainty brings about this condition of complete trust, complete faith. So that's where we would say that doubt is the doorway to faith. Inquiry is the foundation on which we should accept what the Buddha is teaching. So that's what we're doing here, and we'll begin with invoking the wisdom body of Jamgon Mipham. Through the blessing of awareness, emptiness, Manjushri Kumara, you open the expanse of wisdom and its 8 minds of confidence, thus mastering the vast treasuries of transmission and realization. Mipham Manjushri Gosha, I supplicate you. So, undertaking this study with the attitude of the Mahayana, the attitude of wishing to establish all beings at the level of liberation, we'll here be then studying this text and familiarizing ourselves with the topic of Buddhist pramana. And as I have to again humbly confess, this is something in which there's areas in which I am not that good a teacher. And particularly what we're going to be looking at here, correct and false proof statements, you could get that from much better authorities. But that said, I think it's very worthwhile for us to actually investigate this. So that's what we're doing. We're studying this together. I'm probably pretty much, or probably even more intimidated by the material than you possibly are. At the same time, my inspiration, like I'm always saying, is really to bring us to a place where we look at the text and we familiarize ourselves with this. And you're probably going to do much better with this material than I am. But anyway, here we are looking at it together and really celebrating that this exists, that we have the Buddha's teaching that actually accommodates critical thinking, inquiry, analysis, skepticism, cynicism, all of that. And as we look at it, there might be, at least for myself, there's sort of increments of sort of dawning of what's being said and sort of going, oh yeah, that's really useful. Now, so much of what we're also doing is useful in our everyday life. The whole, for example, what we're looking at now, correct and false truth statements, this applies whether it's negotiating the price of a new car or a house or whatever it might be, that we actually bring to the topic critical thinking. Now, what we've established so far in terms of pramana are ways in which we can understand reality, and we looked at before how actually pramana is applied. the inference that we're looking at. We have two kinds of pramanas, basically, we could say. One is what we can directly observe with our senses, and that we could say is free from concepts. That's simply just seeing the wall is white, you know, and so forth. That's where there's no concepts involved. It's simply just plain seeing. We're going to be looking a little more at that, though. But in principle, it's without any concepts. And then there's inference, where we can't see things, but we can infer their existence. We can't see what's behind the wall, but since there were some things there before that we saw with our direct perception, then it's probably likely that it's there. And since the sun rose this morning, it's probably likely that it's going to set tonight, and so forth. So we infer the presence of fire if we see smoke. And that's where we achieve an insight. But then again, if there's someone else, you know, someone who just arrived at the planet, and they look up at the sun and they say, my God, does that thing ever go away? And then we can say, well, it goes, we have experience for it setting every night, and so forth. So that's where we can use this to make others understand. Of course, what we're talking about here, the famous 3 criteria for valid evidence. Socrates is mortal because he is a human. That possesses the reason is, or you could say that what is that which is the reason is innate to the subject. Socrates is he's a human. Innate to Socrates is that he is a human, and therefore we can draw, on the basis of that reasoning, we can draw the conclusion that he is mortal. So these are the 3 criteria for valid evidence: the presence of the reason in the subject, the argument itself, and the what we call forward pervasion. Let's say Socrates is a god, or rather, Socrates is immortal. Well, in that case, he's not human. So that's where we can go back and forth. We can say he is mortal because he's a human. If he were immortal, well, he wouldn't be a human. So that's where we talk about then the forward and reverse or backward pervasion, reverse pervasion. So that's the 3 criteria. And when we present that to somebody else, well, they might say what they want, but they're going to have to, you know, they're going to have to acknowledge what we've said. And that's where we have this. We have it obviously in law. We have it in our own sort of, you could say, discussions. This whole thing of making a valid argument. And that's where we can also identify what is not a valid argument. And that's where we're looking at today. But this presently, what we are talking about is no longer arriving at the view for ourselves, but also communicating it to others compassionately. And that's where we can make certain statements that others will necessarily have to accept. They might not be able to understand it. And that's also actually where we need to adapt to whom we're talking, because presenting something that others can't understand is also seen as a invalid way of making a proof statement. Even though what we might say is true, if the others can't understand it, then we're not succeeding. Anyway, this is what we'll be looking at here. But the the root text says, in formulating refutations, one uses reasons with the 3 criteria for valid evidence to establish autonomous arguments, and one refutes others by showing the consequences, depending on what they assert. So basically, we have to make it in language that others accept. But if the 3 criteria are there, then we can make an autonomous statement. We can say, this is how it is. And that's where we can show with that what the consequence would be. The consequence of Socrates being immortal would be that he couldn't be a human. So that's where you would have to say, if Socrates is a human, he's going to have to be mortal. So that's where you can, you know, there might be some devotees of Socrates that will say he's not ordinary, he's a god, you know, and then we'll have to say he's immortal. Mind you, that in Buddhist context, you know, that's where you might say, hey, wait a minute, the Buddha, wasn't he a human? Hence he's immortal. And no, then Orthodox Buddhists like myself will say, no, he's not an ordinary mortal. He only passes away in order to demonstrate impermanence. But that's also because the reason there is again that the Buddha is he's not ordinary human. Anyway, in general, you hopefully get the gist of this. Anyway, so that's where I'm just going to mainly stick to the commentary from Khenpo Palden Sherab. And he says, within the two broad categories of, actually, let me just bring up the text. Within the two broad categories of proofs and refutations, there are 4 points to be explained: valid proof statements, false proof statements, correct refutations, and false refutations. And false refutations, that's there where we have this situation that we're not really succeeding in our refutation because it's not hitting the mark. The other person doesn't understand. But the first of these, a valid proof statement, has the same meaning as inference for others. So we talk about inference for ourselves, inference for others. And that's what we're then discussing presently, inference for others. The definition basically meaning that what we can understand that makes something valid, if we can express it to others, that's making that inference valid for others. So that's where we talk about the inference for others. And he says, the definition of a valid proof statement is a statement that demonstrates to the opponent. An opponent here, by the way, doesn't mean our enemy. It just means somebody that we're in conversation with that might have a different view. In the Tibetan, we say ngachokpa. It just means the one that's essentially the facing us, the one that we're looking at. So the one who's sort of looking in our way, and that's really all. We are talking about dialectics or dialogue. So we use the word opponent because in debate, yes, there's our view and the others, and if we're right, then we have to make this. We have the other one. It needs to be, you could say, shown the flaw in their assumptions. If you're talking with a kid that's really into sniffing paint thinner, you're gonna have to make the point that it's not healthy. Or whatever, you know, somebody's about to take the wrong road, then you have to make it clear to them, no, that's not going to take you there. So there is sometimes, you know, we could say in absolute truth, everything is entirely relative truth and dependent on the view, and hence there's no absolute, you could say, inherent existence within relative phenomena. But when we are operating within our ordinary conventional reality, then there certainly is an up and down and left and right and so on, and right and wrong. So that's where we have an opponent. Now, the valid proof statement is that which demonstrates to the other exactly what needs to be said without adding anything or leaving anything out. The three criteria for valid evidence as they are established through the opponent's own valid cognition. So that's why the opponent can see that sound is impermanent because it's a produced phenomena. Socrates is mortal because he's a human, and so forth. So valid proof statements have two components: the valid proof statement that apply to the similar class of subject of the syllogism being basically that form of the logical statement that has these three aspects: the subject, the argument, and the forward and reverse pervasion. So that's where we have then, in the case of making a valid proof statement, we have two classes: the similar class and the dissimilar class. And this is where yours truly is a little bit of a neophyte. I can follow the argument and so forth, but I can't say I'm confident in it. So let's just read what Khenpo Palden Sherab has to say about this together. So here he says, here is a sample syllogism for the first of these two components, the similar class. So it says, if something is produced, it must be impermanent, like a pot. Sound is also produced. So we're talking about similar class. So we're using a pot as the example. Now this should be fairly clear. So that's where we're having something that's similar. The pot, sound, they're both produced, and hence they're impermanent. So a proof statement like this demonstrates the presence of the reason in the subject and the positive pervasion to the opponent. So that's where we can see the presence of the reason is that sound, yes, it is impermanent. And we are also saying there's the positive pervasion in that the reason applies to the subject, namely sound. There is this you might think that is sort of a bizarre example, but there are actually there is a notion of sound as being, you could say, ever present, and even within Buddhist Tantra we actually operate with that notion, but we would say it still falls within the category of the unity of appearance and emptiness. If you like, it's a dependent arising. It exists as its existence is imputed on the basis of absence of sound, for example. So we don't attribute it absolute, but we make a point here, particularly, and this is also refuting some schools of thinking that find phenomena which they then refer to as being permanent. And that's where we would say that kind of belief in having a permanent reference point is essentially the cause of suffering. It's not that we want to sit up all night and prove them wrong. I have to be right. You know, I'm a Buddhist and I have my Buddhist view and I'm going to be right. Take what it will, you know. It's not that. It's just that it's the cause of suffering. So that's where this debate is being held on the premise of that. Sorry that I keep changing the page here. Anyway. So a proof statement like this demonstrates the presence of the reason in the subject and the positive pervasion to the opponent. Here is a sample syllogism for the second component, the dissimilar class. If something is impermanent, it must be unproduced, like space. So that's where we're giving the space as the example. Sound, however, is produced. And that is where I guess something it must be unproduced like space. Yeah, I mean, that's setting the two up against each other. So I guess that's what's implied with the dissimilar class. If something is impermanent, it must be unproduced like space. And then we go over and put that in contrast to something that is produced, namely sound. Okay. If somebody's sitting there, philosophically or analytically minded, and say, "Wait a minute, space, is that then a permanent thing?" No, we wouldn't. We would still say space is imputed, even though it's an unproduced phenomena. We wouldn't give it an absolute. We wouldn't refer to it as absolute because it's still identified in terms of its in relation to what is not space. You could say what is concrete or solid. So that's where space is not an absolute, but it is something that we refer to as a permanent phenomenon in that it's unproduced. A proof statement like this demonstrates the presence of the reason in the subject and the counter pervasion to the opponent. And let's just see what the notes have. 276 was it? And this again, let me just, this sometimes maybe the notes can be more confusing than helpful, but let's give it a go anyway. Dignaga says that the counter pervasion is based on the logical sign not being known to occur in any other loci in which the property to be proven is absent. Not being known to occur in any other loci is another way of saying the dissimilar class. Here, the dissimilar class is impermanent things that are unproduced, i.e. that are produced. Space is not an impermanent thing and is not produced, so it is not found in the dissimilar class, and the counter pervasion is correct. Here, sound acts as a correct dissimilar example because it does not produce the qualities of either the sign or the predicate. Unlike space, Sound is not unproduced, and is not permanent. Well, I think we can all see the difference between something like space, unproduced, and sound, produced. But as far as following the reasoning there, like I say, I'm sure there's some of you who get that, but yours truly here is having a hard time following the argument there. So I rejoice in those of you who fully understood that. And for those who didn't, then hey, then we're in this together. Anyway, I have no doubt that there was something very significant stated there. The second type of proof statement, I would also say we aren't just opposing two, you could say, truths that stand opposed to each other. And the argument is that they're different. So yes, there's space that's one way, and there's sound that is another way. One is unproduced, one is produced. So I guess that's where the dissimilar class applies. Okay. Okay. The second type of proof statement is a false proof statement. It is defined as that which is set forth as a proof statement and has a relevant fault. Okay, there are three types of false proof statements: faulty in relation to the opponent's mind, faulty in relation to facts, and faulty in relation to the wording. First, in relation to the mind, a happy feeling is not the mind because the feeling arises and perishes. Okay, this is where we are onto the Samkhya tradition. Okay, this false proof statement is related to a non-Buddhist philosophy, possibly the Samkhya school, that believes that happiness is found in objects and not in the mind. For them, mind is always existent. That's what we call purusha, and never changes. This stands in opposition to then phenomena, which is prakrit, if I'm not wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. But anyway, there we would say the pure consciousness or pure mind is unchanging, and that which arises is then different from it. So that's where the fact that something is seen as arising, such as a happy feeling, it's not mind, it's phenomena. And that's where we refer to mind as being Purusha, or you say, unchanging cosmic ground, and what arises and perishes are the phenomena, Prakrit. So then second, so that's in relation to the mind. So that's, I guess, the view that we're refuting there, or exposing that's flawed. Second, a false proof statement. That's where I guess we are encouraged to identify flawed statements. Second, a false proof statement in relation to facts would be sound is permanent because it is whichever is suitable, either the presence of the reason in the subject or the similar class. Again, I hope you understand it. The reason, whichever is suitable, does not seem to make sense, but saying sound is permanent is enough to make this syllogism a false statement in relation to the facts. So I guess the person there is not making the sort of whichever is suitable is not really making any kind of statement at all. But I humbly concede defeat here in terms of understanding it. Third, a false proof statement in relation to wording. Sound is impermanent because it is produced like a pot. Also, sound is produced because of that. Sound is impermanent. Sound is impermanent because it is produced like a pot. Also, sound is produced because of that. Sound is impermanent. I think we're all sort of onto what the argument really consists of, but identifying the exact subtle nature in which this is a false proof statement again eludes me somewhat. Khenpo says, in a statement like this, the thesis, the reason, the example, the secondary syllogism, and the conclusion are all enmeshed. I tend to agree. It looks pretty enmeshed. Someone says, is space the only thing which is considered as permanent in Buddhism? Are all other dependent and produced? Well, we have what we call non-associated, what are they called? Non-associated compositional factors. Denmin Duce. And these are things like time or birth, death, and so forth, things that are very real, and yet we can't really identify them other as simply just relative imputations. They're not solid phenomena that are produced in any way, like time, right? Or space or location, so forth. So we don't give them any, we don't refer to them as how do you say, we refer to them as permanent phenomena, but also they're not considered as produced. Yeah. Denmin-Duce, non-associated compositional factors. That's a wonderful, that's a wonderful Buddhist term, but that's what translators generally use for that. Anyway, there are things that we can observe that are apparently permanent and yet not, not produced, but they still don't constitute absolutes. Yeah, they're imputed. They're what we call dependently imputed. You know, space in relation to what is not space, time. Again, something that we cannot find any inherent existence except that we can impute its presence. Okay, so these were the proofs, and now refutations. Again, here we are in a dialogue, and there we need to make a statement, right? Is Buddha nature Dharmakaya permanent? Yes, but we would still refer to it not as something that has inherent existence, and that's where we need to distinguish a little bit between what we call ontology and phenomenology. We need to distinguish between the experience, which is the condition of awakening, and yet understanding that that awakening takes place in the absence of any kind of clinging dualistic fixation. So in the absence of any fixation, then there is the complete awakening to that which is unborn, undying, uncreated in any way. And so we would never say the Dharmakaya is solid and permanent. And yet, of course, when there's awakening, we go beyond the relative constructs of time and space. So as such, then you find, if you read the Uttara Tantra Shastra, the teachings on Buddha nature, Maitreya's famous work, the Uttara Tantra, we refer to Buddha nature in ways that require that we first have established emptiness, that we first have established the freedom from any conceptual constructs. So having done that through what we call the second turning of the wheel, the teachings on shunyata, then the third turning of the wheel introduces, you could say, the affirmative nature of this realization of shunyata, which is its luminous quality, which is beyond time and space and any conceptual constructs. But within the Uttara Tantra Shastra, we then refer to this as being pure, as being permanent, and being self. But that's where we would say it's so important that we first establish the insight into shunyata. And as such, these two work together. It's not as there's sometimes people say, oh, one is more true than the other. Shunyata is more real than Buddha nature, or vice versa. But the general view from the great beings such as Longchenpa, Shantarakshita, Jigme Lingpa, Jamgun Mipham, and all your teachers here, whether it's Chögyam Trungpa, Tsongsa Gyaltsen Rinpoche, or the various gurus, they would all assert that second and third turning are in harmony. They're equally what we call definitive truth. Okay, a lot to be said about that, however, as you can hear. Correct and false refutations. The second main category here is refutations, which has two categories, okay, subcategories: correct refutations and false refutations. First, a correct refutation is defined as a statement that expresses a fault to a person with a faulty position, such that the person is able to see the fault. So that's a correct refutation. See, a bit further down, I've noted the opposite being the second type of refutation is a false refutation, which is defined as a statement of criticism that expresses a fault to a person with a faulty position, but the person is unable to see the fault. So that's just basically just doesn't work. However true your refutation might be. So let's look here then what the Khenpo says. In terms of how correct refutations are stated, there are two types. First, there are refutations that set forth reasons using autonomous arguments, like, for example, the 3 criteria, as is done in inference for one's own sake, using reasons that have the 3 criteria for valid evidence. Yeah, that's correct refutation that we saw earlier. Second, there are refutations through consequence statements that rely on the assertion of the opponent to show that the 3 criteria for evidence are not complete. So that's where we might say Socrates is immortal because he's a great guy, and that's where you could say the others, if someone makes that statement, we can show that the 3 criteria for valid evidence are not complete. Simply being a great guy doesn't make you immortal. Let's see what the notes say. Consequences are stated on the basis of positions being attacked, not on positions being held. In showing the consequences, the reason may be acceptable in the context of the opponent's position. Okay. So, okay, yeah. This sounds perfectly logical, and I'm a little bit sort of failing in getting it, but yes, there's probably about the positions held. And there are different times where you would make an assertion depending on whether you're simply just showing that something's right without necessarily wanting to make a statement, but really just rather you want to expose the flaw of the other without necessarily having to make a statement yourself. That's what possibly is being said here. Yeah, it's stated on the positions of being attacked, So you, for example, you might want to say you might want to make the point to your friend, the teenager who loves sniffing paint thinner, that it's unhealthy, but instead of saying it's unhealthy, you could say, well, your mate Joe, who's been doing this for 6 months, does he look like he's having a great time? That sort of thing. So you're really more just going along with not making a positive statement, but more exposing the flaw in the other's thesis or position. Second, okay. Here are illustrations of these 2 types of refutation. For an opponent who asserts that sound is permanent, an autonomous argument would be, sound is impermanent because it is produced. Yeah, that's an autonomous argument. Second, to show the unwanted consequence to the same opponent, because of being permanent, sound would have to be unproduced. See, that's where you're showing, you're not making any kind of statement other than you're basically exposing the flaw of the others. If sound was permanent, then sound would have to be unproduced. If sniffing paint thinner is so brilliant, then people who have done it for a long time would have to look incredibly happy, right, and healthy, etc. So by making a proof statement using the sign that the opponent asserted, such as permanence, one throws back the unwanted consequence of their assertion, right? You don't make a statement yourself, you just you expose the flaw of their assertion. There are several ways of throwing back the consequences, depending on what seems fitting. It would depend on whether the sign is valid or the pervasion is valid, and how the opponent's proof is stated, and so on. Yeah. And then we have the various ways of throwing back the consequences. Gosh, I remember there's what is it, Voltaire, I think he wrote 30 ways to win an argument. You should Google it. Some of it's quite funny. I remember one of them was, make sure to make the opponent angry. That's a little bit below the belt, and we're not using something like that, but I guess you could it's definitely that this kind of, you could say, the sort of the whole process of debate is something it's something that we have in our life. It's something that's also basic to Western philosophy. And again, coming back, the second time refutation is a fault refutation, which is defined as a statement of criticism that expresses a fault to a person with a faulty position, but the person is unable to see the fault. Yeah. So that's basically the correct and false proofs and correct and false refutations. And then there's also consequent statements. Again, just simply showing the consequence very simply. An auxiliary point to be added here is the definition of a correct consequence statement. This is a consequence statement that cannot be overridden by a rejoinder from the opponent. Again, if we just make a statement saying, you know, doing this, going down that road will take you to the wrong destination, or again, you know, if this was the fact, you know, if it was really great to eat junk food every night, you know, then people who eat junk food would display tremendous health and so forth, right? In other words, the opponent can no longer argue with the proponent. In contrast, a false consequence statement is defined as a consequence statement that can be overridden by a rejoinder from the opponent. So if he just says, you know, eating junk food every night would ruin your economy, then somebody could say, no, actually, you know, we eat the cheapest junk food possible. And so that's where the argument falls to the ground, right? And so forth. This is quite valuable for us when we are proceeding with seeing what's valid and not valid in ordinary life, but also when we're looking at the Dharma and we can appreciate the depth of the argument. For example, all phenomena are empty because they're dependently arisen. We can apply that in terms of our own inference, and that's helpful for us. It will make us less rigid. It is what dissolves ego. It is what promotes compassion. And within that, what we call the lion's roar of the Buddha's teaching, the teaching on dependent arising, you could say all flaws in terms of dealing with reality are eliminated and all qualities associated with liberation are present. Conventional and ultimate valid cognition. Now this, you'll love this. It's essentially understanding the relative truth, science, and ultimate valid cognition, greater science, if you like. But that's where we're going to be seeing something very, very interesting in ways how we understand our conventional reality, because our conventional reality, yes, it is the conventional appearing objects, but isn't it interesting that we see things differently? And within conventional reality, yes, we can say that things, you know, that we have gravity, things fall to the ground on this planet and so forth. But there's also aspects of our reality that go beyond just what we can objectively verify on the basis of an ordinary disposition. And that's where we would have to say that the sage and an ordinary person, they're looking at the same meal or looking at the same person or looking at the same house or whatever. And yet, yes, they're seeing the same. If you ask the Dalai Lama, you hold up your, you know, your phone and you ask the Dalai Lama, what is this? The Dalai Lama will say, it's a phone, it's a mobile phone. But the way the Dalai Lama sees things might be slightly different. And that's why we're going to be talking about two kinds of conventional valid cognition. And as far as ultimate goes, also there, because right now we can actually assert on the basis of inference that we have just established, right? We can establish on the basis of that the insight that things are impermanent, whatever is composite is impermanent, and whatever is dependently arisen has no inherent nature. We can establish that insight. And that is an absolute. But hold on, we probably also realize there's a big difference between an intellectual that sits and says, you know, all phenomena are empty in that they are dependently arisen, and a sage, the Dalai Lama, that says all phenomena are empty. We probably will know there's a difference in that. And that's why also sometimes, sadly, in modern Buddhism, there's sort of the idea that, oh, I don't want to know about emptiness. You know, I don't want to know all of that. You know, that'll come one day. I'll just realize it'll sort of land on me somehow, you know. So that's where we have first what we call the categorized or enumerated understanding of ultimate truth. You could say the conceptual way of understanding absolute truth, which is extremely valuable, and then also the realization. So as you can see here, there's a big difference between conventional and ultimate valid cognition depending on the subject. And this is what Mipham Rinpoche is going to be presenting to us. So the second main section of inferential valid cognition is its classifications. So we're still in inferential valid cognition. 290, what does it say? The three main sections of inferential valid cognition are its nature, and that's where we've looked at it in various ways. I think there was within that there was 4 subcategories. So we've completed these. We're now looking at its classifications. That's the one we're looking at now, and a response to objections. That'll be the last section within this section on inferential valid cognition. The entire discussion of inference up to this point has been on the nature of inference. So that's where we understand its validity, or rather its nature. And now we'll see how valid cognition can be understood. And that's why essentially we're talking about the 2 truths, which of course have so much to do with the subject that sees things for what they are or sees things as they appear. And that's where sentient beings, they are lost because they fail to understand the nature of what they're experiencing due to their confusion. Sentient beings are not bad, they're innocent, but due to confusion, just being a bit lost, then there's a misapprehension, there's a misunderstanding about reality. And sadly, as a consequence, sentient beings, without having done anything wrong, they are wandering in suffering. And that's where the Buddha wants to come in and say, hey, try and look beyond what you think things are. Don't believe everything you think. Wider perspective, vipassana, and so on, wisdom. So the second main section of inferential valid cognition is its classifications, which have a main part and a summary. The main part has 2 aspects: the valid cognition of conventional reality and the valid cognition that investigates ultimate reality. So your local supermarket, taxes, your dog, your house, everything that we operate with, yes, it's still there and it's not going to go away. But as far as the way that we relate to all our given appearances and perceptions, that's what we want to have a look at. And that's where we get terribly sad when our dog dies. We get upset when the supermarket is out of what we're used to having, or they close early and what have you, and so forth. So that's where we have not just, you could say, phenomena, but also our way of engaging phenomena. So that's where presently we then look at this conventional reality with a little bit of knowing that, yes, there's a reality, but it's really just a conventional reality. So first, for the conventional valid cognition, the root text says, on the conventional level, since there are appearances that do not accord with reality, there are the way things appear and the way things are. So that's where we end up having simply just not really understanding things. And that's where science can be very helpful. They help us understand the nature of things, whether it's molecular physics or the universe, or how we could develop new medicine or technologies, right? So that's where we have a science that looks at how things are. But of course, when it comes to the Buddhist teaching, we particularly are interested in understanding the actual abiding nature of things, not just how they function, but the abiding nature of things. So we distinguish between the way things appear and the way things are. Independence on impure, ordinary perceptions, right? This is our ordinary individual who looks at things. Or pure vision. There are two types of conventional valid cognition which resemble human eyes and divine eyes. The eyes of an ordinary individual and the eye of a sage. These have their own features and are categorized by their natures, causes, effects, and functions. So we'll go into the depth of these two ways of perceiving conventional reality. Then the root text says, a mind that is unmistaken about ordinary facts arises from having correctly apprehended its objects. Valid ordinary perception eliminates misunderstandings about objects and fully understands the facts of a situation. Limitless, timeless awareness arises from seeing suchness just as it is. It eliminates misunderstandings about its objects, which are inconceivable, and results in knowing the entire extent of phenomena. So we're presently talking about conventional reality. And what we're talking about here then, in terms of conventional reality, we can look at the basic premise. What we're talking about is valid cognition, seeing beyond appearances, seeing things for what they actually are. Now, when we talk about just our ordinary perception, we see one thing, and that's where you could say what the ordinary scientists might have to say about reality is very important. But the pure vision belongs to a greater science that, of course, accepts the findings of ordinary science, but also goes a bit further. You'll never find a Lama who isn't profoundly impressed with the Western medicine or Western technology. You know, the Dalai Lama, even when he was a young man, taking apart watches and being fascinated with technology in general, right? But there's more to reality than just these, you could say, objective phenomena. And that's where the way that we engage in this is we should understand that the way that we're looking at things can be understood in terms of impure ordinary perception, general science, or pure vision, which is much greater. So that's where there's two types of conventional valid cognition. They resemble human eyes, ordinary eyes, and the divine eyes, meaning unobscured vision. So these have their own features, either of them. So let's distinguish again the two. A mind that is unmistaken about ordinary facts arises from having correctly apprehended its objects. And that's where we peer down the microscope and we begin to understand how, you could say, molecules and so forth, they operate. We can point our optics to the skies and understand the universe out there. We can relate to things and understand how different metals, they operate within different contexts and so forth. So we have a mind that's unmistaken about ordinary facts, and that's having correctly understood its objects. You know, titanium will melt at a different temperature than, say, lead or aluminium, what have you. That's correct understanding. That's valid ordinary perception, and that eliminates misunderstandings about objects. That's where you want to have your, you know, your technological device made from titanium, not lead, and so forth, you know? So that's where valid ordinary perception eliminates misunderstandings about objects and fully apprehends the facts of a situation. That's where we basically use ordinary perception and understand how things are. But for the sage, when there's no obscurations, then the sublime being operates from a place of limitless, timeless awareness, and that arises from seeing suchness just as it is. With suchness, that is seeing the unity of appearance and emptiness. That's where we see, yes, things appear, yet they have no inherent existence. That's seeing suchness. And that's here, we're not just talking about knowing that as per the books, but having realized that. And that's where this awareness that is innate to our being, when it's not obscured, we see things for what they are. That's what we dekonani or deshinyi in Tibetan is suchness. So for example, tata in Tathagata, those gone to suchness, right? It eliminates misunderstandings about objects which are inconceivable. And that's where the object is not just the object in terms of lead and titanium, but it's understanding the ultimate nature of phenomena, their suchness, that which lies beyond the scope of the ordinary dualistic mind, beyond the ordinary concepts. It's seeing the object which is inconceivable. And that's where there's a complete understanding of phenomena. That's where we understand both consciousness, and it's also where we understand matter. There's a complete understanding of these themes. And that's where we go beyond, you could say, the confined science that still is sort of scratching his head and not entirely sure exactly what is matter and what exactly is consciousness. But this is not about better or worse. It's just to really identify that the scope of the Buddhist teaching operates with the way in which then the first person experience is what is determine our perceptions. That's what creates our perceptions. So I haven't seen any questions come in yet, so I'm just going to continue a little bit with the commentary, but please feel free to write questions. I hope this is making sense. This is where we're looking at what we could call two places of experience. One is that which is within the ordinary frame of mind, shared karmic perceptions, and that which goes beyond the experience of awakening. And that's where we experience our conventional world in two different ways, depending on the mind that's experiencing it. And also we understand the absolute nature of things, depending on whether we're understanding it in terms of just our logical intellect or whether we actually have experience. So this is a really important theme, and it's so much reflected in everything we're doing on the path. You know, you might be on one moment you're reciting a text that sort of highlights impermanence and death and the Four Noble Truths. And then you might have another text that's talking about how the nature of phenomena is unborn, undying, and luminous, and how the nature of the three kayas. Those of you who have a chance, please look at Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche's teachings on the Vimalakirti Niyadesa Sutra, or the sutra itself, which is very much like other Mahayana sutras, talking about, on one hand, the understanding, the limited understanding of the Four Noble Truths and our conventional reality, but also pointing to the inconceivable. So that's why if you read the Flower Ornament Sutra or any of the Mahayana sutras, they point that the reality is far greater than you might think it is. And the Vimalakirti Niyadesa Sutra is very funny because it talks about how these different, what we call Shravakas, those sort of that are still at the initial stage of the path, they're being supposed to go over and inquire. The Buddha wants to inquire, how is Vimalakirti doing? Because he heard he was sick. So there's all these, he says, could you please, he says to Shariputra, can you please go and check in on him? Or says to Subhuti, can you go and check in on Vimalakirti? And they're like, no, we don't want to go there because Vimalakirti he's a layman, but he's also a bodhisattva. And he frightens these guys. He's like, he blows their mind. He's out there. So they're a little bit reluctant to go and see him. And there's some very funny dialogues and a lot of really mind-blowing teachings in that sutra. So Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche has taught on it. He also taught on it, I think, somewhere in Delhi. And the YouTube videos on this are really delightful. All right, no questions? Okay. So commenting on 42 and 43, and I'll read them without my own commentary, all right? On the conventional level, since there are appearances that do not accord with reality, there are the way things appear and the way things are. In dependence on impure, ordinary perception or pure vision, there are two types of conventional valid cognition, which resemble human eyes and divine eyes. These two have their own features and are categorized by their natures, causes, effects, and functions. So here the commentary then runs. The conventional relative truth appears differently depending on whether the way things appear accords with the way things truly are. It's basically what we're saying here. The relative truth will appear differently whether we are out of it or not, whether we're when we're a bit delusional or whether we're not delusional. So that's basically being, you could say, seeing things clearly or not seeing things clearly. And that's where we can see things in accordance to the way things are, or we might not see things the way they actually are. We're hallucinating. So there are definitely two levels of conventional valid cognition, in that the relative truth is comprehended as either pure, impure, or pure. So that means, okay, impure conventional valid cognition is the ordinary confined perception of worldly people. And pure conventional valid cognition is based on the vision of sublime beings. Examples of these two are human eyes, which merely see the objects on their own level, and divine eyes, which see human objects as well as their own objects. This, in a way, is so simple, so I don't want to overcomplicate it, but it really just means, are we seeing clearly or not? And that's where the sage simply sees far clearer. Now, for us who are practicing the path, and particularly if you come across Vajrayana Buddhism operates with the perception of relative conventional perception as pure. That's where we would say at that point, the ordinary impure perception, which is understanding things as most people would do, that is seeing things as we ordinarily do, just in terms of the five elements. But when we have pure, when we're no longer confused, when there is wisdom, that's where we have then a pure conventional valid cognition. And that's where we engage that vision as we do it in the yogas of the Vajrayana that involve, for example, development stage practice in which we visualize our ordinary conventional self as no longer held by the confused projections. And that is where we're seeing things in accordance with the way they are. That there's the appearance and there is the way things are. And there's the appearance of our body, and yet our ordinary karmic vision is seeing these in terms of our, well, karmic ordinary vision, impure. And that's where we're introducing in the development stage a perspective of our being, our body, and also the world around, the way that breaks our ordinary habit and introduces what we call the unity between how things appear and the way they are. Appearance, emptiness. And that's the foundation for the Vajrayana pure perception. So this is very important in terms of us approaching the Vajrayana, that what we mean with visualization of mandala, deity, mantra, and so forth, everything that has to do with pure perception comes from this insight into the alignment between how things are, or rather how things appear, and how they are. So this is very significant. Okay, here's a question then. Okay, yes, it is one of the best things I've seen. Yep. Vimalakirti teachings, I mean. Video teachings, very funny at times, yes. I haven't seen all of it, but I've seen sections, and it's really delightful. Rinpoche is just so playful, and there's a whole little sort of show going on in the context of the teaching, so please don't miss that. Yeah, yeah. There are two types of conventional valid cognition, which resemble human eyes and divine eyes. Why there are three kayas? Well, that's essentially seeing things without obscurations. That's the scope of the divine eyes. But again, that's where when we talk about the three kayas, how things are, when we talk about things as they are seen with divine eyes, we're talking ontology. We're talking about how things actually are. That's where we talk about there's appearances, yes, but what is the true nature of appearances? And that's where we can understand presently that because things are dependent or arisen, they are empty. They are never going to be staying the same. They're not solidly one way or another. And that's where even though we can't see it right now, or we're inclined to grasp and fixate on things, we can understand, hey, phenomena are intrinsically empty. And that's when we present, for example, the language of what we call the result, the language of the definitive nature, nitartha. We're presenting that because we could possibly get what's being talked about. And it becomes, you could say, an insight that where we can see, yes, isn't it a paradox that phenomena are in one way and yet I perceive it in another? And that is what motivates us towards the practice of the path. We can see, for example, somebody possesses wisdom and compassion, and we could say, yes, I'd like to be like that person. And we can understand this is what we strive towards. And we also see that person who has wisdom and compassion is not a delusional mad person, but someone who actually lives very elegantly within the phenomenal world. Clearly, that person is onto something. And that's where we then say, hey, Buddha, or hey, Vajrayana, hey, Rinpoche, how do you see things? And that's where then the Buddha teaches valid cognition. And that's where the Buddha then teaches with the divine eye and tries to say, hey, try and look at things. Try and look at things. What Vipassana really just is this wider perspective that we're being encouraged to adopt. Why there are three kayas? Are the Dhammakaya and Sambhogakaya belong to the divine eyes? Well, the Dhammakaya is you could say the condition of not being confused, and that comes with certain qualities. The niyamana with the Sambhogakaya, the qualities of the Sambhogakaya, if you like. That's simply the quality aspect of the awakened condition. And that is not just a self-absorbed little narcissistic nirvana, but it is a place in which, in the absence of self, there's you could say, the expansive caring for those that suffer, without thinking, oh, I'm going to go and help sentient beings, but just organically, spontaneously, there is the acting for the benefit of sentient beings, and that's what we call the Niyamanakaya. So we can describe this in different ways. Of course, it can be a bit confusing because sometimes we talk about the three kayas just simply in terms of the nature of mind, the emptiness nature, its cognizant nature, and the unity of the two, as Dhammakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Niyamanakaya. We also in the Mahayana Sutras talk about the Niyamanakaya Buddha field, which is also interesting if you've read the Vimalakirti Nirdesa Sutra. So in the Mahayana, these will be explained in terms of realms. But in the Vajrayana, there's very much that these realms, they already exist spontaneously with our own given reality. And so there's a more provocative dimension present in the Vajrayana. But basically, Dhammakaya, the absence of confusion, the Sambhogakaya, the qualities that manifest within that absence of confusion, and Niyamanakaya, the compassionate display for sentient beings. We sometimes actually talk about additional kayas. Sometimes we talk about a fourth kaya, which is the Svabhavika kaya, which is the unity of the three. It's not like these three are different things. You have to hold on. Wait a minute, I've got the Dhammakaya here, and got the Sambhogakaya, and then the Niyamanakaya. They're all united in one single nature. But it's just identifying, you could say, dimensions or qualities of this nature. Then sometimes in the Nyingma tradition, then you talk about five kayas, which introduces, what is it again? The Nunpa and Chanchup Dorjiku or something. There's two more kayas that within the, particularly the Mahayoga sections of the Nyingma Tantras, they talk about five kayas. Yeah, please, let's aspire to be as compassionate and wise as our wonderful teachers. I agree. I join you in that prayer. Okay. Well, look, my watch is not really working, and it tells me it's 10 o'clock, but my phone, which is working better, tells me it's 5 past. So we'll conclude at this point. So thank you very much for joining us here with this study, and we'll continue next week. Oh, just forgot dedication. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together.